getting to know somebody. It's also the fact that I'm looking at somebody in person and just seeing who they are physically. But that's just like the surface for me. Identity is like when I'm looking at someone, that's like the surface level for me. But when we're talking about deeper identity, I'm thinking when you start to speak to that someone, you get to know them, their name, like how old they are, where they're from, where they grew up in. And identity is really who you are on the inside and your beliefs and where you come from and where like the roots of your whole family comes from. Like that's what identity is to me. The surface of it is the physical form, but like underground, it's just that it's the little details that just are in you. That's like everything that just revolves around who you are, your hobbies, your story, your experiences, your where you are in your life and everything. That's like what identity is to me.
I find a lot of the time that when, someone asks us, tell me about yourself, what do you do, whatever, we often talk about the organizations or what we are associated with. So I went to school here, I work here, I dance here. Those organizations that, the people that are involved there, the culture of like being in that community, those kinds of things kind of make up who you are. And I was going to say as well, often, at least in the present day, a lot of people ask, the first question is, what do you do for work? Or like, what is your career? Where do you orient yourself in that kind of sense? What industry are you in? So I guess I would say that is also part of identity. But if I were speaking personally, I would say that I certainly, in a job interview, if someone says, tell me about yourself, I always, speak about my experiences and what I've been associated with, where I've gone to school, what opportunities I've had, things like that. So
when I think of this concept of identity, I sort of think of the question of like the question like, who are you, comes to mind. And it's a pretty loaded question because, as has already been like touched on, there's certain context. Who you are can sort of change depending on the context that you're in. And it can especially change over time. So I feel like, depending on who's asking me the question and depending on where I'm talking about myself, I suppose, like my answer is going to change. And I think in that regard, identity is linked very closely to a particular situation.
I think that for me, identity would be honestly just everything that makes me who I am, whether it be my sexuality or my religion, stuff like that. Yes, where I've gone to school, like all the little bits and pieces that make me who I am, like my values. What do I believe in life that create me? It's also just like also always holding myself accountable in my own identity. It's just like realizing that I've caused harm, but I'm going to move on to be a better person. And so it's just like always keeping that in terms with my identity.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said, right? Identity can be different for everyone, but for me, it's kind of just a combination of everything that makes me who I am, right? So my hobbies, my interests, my religion, my ethnicity, where I was born, right? So for me, when someone asks me, who are you? I usually say like, I'm Israeli Canadian, right? I'm an Israeli Canadian Jew, right? So I think also building on what Daniel said is that it depends kind of where I am and who's asking me. I think that when I'm in Canada or when I'm here, I think having that Israeli part in front of the Canadian just makes me, I don't know, feel more connected to being Jewish and being Israeli. So I think also kind of like the order that I say it changes too, where I am.
For me, when I think of what identity is, I think of my family and where I come from is really important. And I also think of my culture and my traditions, my language. I think all of those key elements are really important and really shape who I am as a person, and as well as what everyone said, like just a combination of everything that makes me me.
For me, it's kind of interesting because I have a friend, her name's Alika, but she's whenever someone asks her, like they ask her, they're like, "Who are you?" Like, because she's Inuk, and she's like, "I'm human," and that's all like she says. But like they always like want more out of her, and it's just kind of interesting to see like, why do we always want more? Like, why can't we? You know? Does that make sense? I don't know, but
No, it totally makes sense. And this is something I was thinking about as Daniela and Daniel were speaking about, like depending on like who asks you, and like there's kind of like this sense of vulnerability involved in identity, because it's so close to like how you think of yourself, like all that you are and all your makeup. It's like sometimes it is hard to share that with certain people or in certain contexts. And it's interesting because I'm actually writing an essay currently on the it's on a particular poem, but I'm focusing on the notion of identity and how different spaces can bring about different parts of your identity. So it's not that those parts are never there, it's just that they become more present in different spaces. So like your friend, for instance, like when she's by herself, maybe, you know, there's a different kind of, or maybe she's with a close friend, maybe that answer becomes different. It just kind of like, identity is really multifaceted and just depends on how you express it.
So also personal identity, it's who you define yourself to be. And that's also kind of tricky in its own way, because I'm always changing. You know, I don't really know how to define myself. I don't really know what I'm going to be like in a few weeks from now, in a few months from now, in a few years from now, right? I can say that I've changed from when I was in high school, even university, to now, right? So it could be hard to define who you are and put an identity in kind of a box, right? Because it's ever changing.
That is exactly sort of what I'm going to touch on. I right now I work in mental health, and I work in Vancouver. And I was speaking with a client today, and I've been thinking about the fact that we were going to have this conversation tonight. And I knew that it was going to have something to do with identity. And this client, over the course of the last several months, he's been telling me every single chapter of his life story. And I mean, like every detail. And he talks about how, you know, he was born in Australia, lived in Ontario, then lived in England, then lived in British Columbia. And then he was talking about, you know, living in BC, and he referred to, he said we when he was talking about, like, yeah, we like the warmer weather or something like that. And I was like, so do you identify as British Columbian then? Because at this point in his life story, I've only heard up to the point where he's lived in Australia, England, and Ontario. And I'm like, so what version of your identity is we referring to? Are you referring to British Columbia? And he's like, well, I guess it sort of changes depending on what I'm talking about. But in this situation, I'm referring to we as me identifying as British Columbian. And that's just one small section of identity, but it sort of demonstrates how it really changes based on not necessarily even the time, but like what you're talking about, you know?